The first superhero movie based on a comic strip is often stated to be the 1941 film serial The Adventures of Captain Marvel, based on a creation of Fawcett Comics, which was later taken over by DC Comics and has nothing to do with Captain Marvel from Marvel Comics, all of which could be confusing to persons of lesser intellect. Now, I would take issue with this because between 1936 and 1940, two superheroes from comic strips starred in several film serials, giving us archetypes whose names even today invoke daring do in space, and they were Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers. Flash Gordon is on your right. No, wait, on your left. I think, yes, your left. There's a flash on his shirt. Greetings and felicitations. I'm Mark Hensel, a rocket scientist, and I'm on a mission to explore how depictions of spaceflight in film have dominated our culture's understanding of space, creating what I'm going to be calling fairy space, a genre which is what humanity now takes to be the reality of space and space flight. Now, in this video, I'm going to be looking at Flash Gordon with a very quick side glance at Buck Rogers. And yes, both originated in comic strips. Buck Rogers started in 1929 and Flash Gordon started in 1934. By comic strips, what I mean is they were strips of pictures that were published in newspapers, which included illustrated humour and adventure stories, this being in the days when news stories were just news, whereas these days, for efficiency, the jokes and the fantasy are now included in the main copy. Flash Gordon was the first to be turned into a film serial in 1936. It starred Buster Crabbe, an Olympic swimmer turned actor. Buck Rogers' serial was made in 1939 and starred Larry Crabbe. And yes, it is the same person, hence the difficulty telling one from t'other. It's not helped by the fact that, as a cost-saving measure, elements of Flash Gordon's attire was reused in Buck Rogers' uniform. So we're definitely a long way from no expense spared blockbusters here. And the reason for this economy is that these were not feature films but serials, where the story is split into 12 to 15 episodes, with each episode ending on the proverbial cliffhanger. The aim here, of course, is to give punters an extra incentive to return if the following week's main feature proves, well, a bit weak. Remember, this is before multiplexes, and cinemas were reliant on the one feature that they were showing to bring the punters in. However, these serials were also shown in news cinemas. Now, these were smaller venues specialising in showing newsreels, but the newsreels were padded out with shorter films such as travelogues, short cartoons and, well, serials. These were shown in a continuously repeating programme, and you entered when you wanted to and you left when you got bored. Now, as television took over the role of news reporting, these venues faded away. One of these in London's Piccadilly Circus was called the Eros News Theatre, and it survived longer than most, although latterly it tended to be marketed more as a cartoon cinema than a news cinema. The name Eros is a misnomer. The statue at the centre of Piccadilly Circus is not Eros but Anteros, who is the Greek god of returned love, representing Christian charity. An interesting role for a pagan god in a monotheistic religion. I used to frequent the Eros myself when in London and with a bit of time to kill, getting a much appreciated dose of Tom and Jerry and the like. In 1976, it was reworked as a soft porn venue, which at least made the name Eros finally appropriate, and it was after this repurposing that it earned a role in the film American Werewolf in London. With the slow demise of news cinemas, the serials then took on a new life as part of the children's cinema clubs. These Saturday programmes were a popular way for parents to incarcerate their unruly brats for a few hours. And the serials were performing this role decades after they had been originally made, and thus financially outperformed most high budget movies. But more importantly, and why I'm highlighting the history of how they were shown, is to emphasise the longevity of the product, which is being seen by audiences for decades. Whereas the high budget main features would be seen for the few weeks after its release, and remember before television and VHS tapes, would never be seen again. I would say that seeing these serials one episode a week is the best way to view them. If they are binge viewed back to back in a 3 to 5 hour marathon, well, the narrative flaws really do start to show. And the fact that each episode, each 20-minute episode, only contains a little over 10 minutes of new material after the recaps, the title sequence, and the repeated use of the same stock footage is accounted for. The basic story of the first Flash Gordon serial is that Flash and Dale Ardent are persuaded by Dr. Zarkov, with the aid of a Colt semi-automatic pistol in his hand, to fly to the planet Mong, which he believes is the source of catastrophic events that are being inflicted on the Earth. To get there, they employ a spaceship that Dr. Zarkov has apparently made in his back garden shed, and they are flying it without FAA approval. Elon Musk and SpaceX must be green with envy. Once on Mong, they come across Emperor Ming the Merciless, a name that is a bit of a giveaway that he's the baddie. There's no moral ambiguity or complex character development here, and of course he has a throne room, and thus the conflict commences. Because of the highly episodic way that the stories are being told, they are rather well episodic and rather short of a complex plot, because after recapping the last episode and making sure that there's some entertaining action, whether the story needs it or not, and ensuring that each episode ends in a desperate, perilous situation, there's not a lot of room left over to tell a complex story. Indeed, although it's not what was intended, watching single episodes in isolation or out of order still works, which is just as well because that's how they were mostly experienced from the 1950s onwards. Now, of course, it is a very cheap shot to make fun of a low-budget 1930s production, maybe to the point of being morally reprehensible. But let's do it anyway. Starting with the cast. It's difficult to complain about Buster Crabbe. He was an Olympic gold medalist swimmer and consequently had the physique to match the role. My good friend Jerry Webb actually met him in later life.
And about three of us with just remaining, and it was by then maybe 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, probably about 10 o'clock, past 9, 10, went down the bar with Buster Crabbe and had a chat, which went on until whenever they threw us out. And he was the most marvellous guy. He was, first of all, he was modest, and secondly, he was still athletic. He suffered, and I do sympathise. Flash. I better call him Flash rather than Buster, but because I've got arthritis now, and he made a living by selling arthritis cures, because that's what he was doing, but he was great, and he was modest, and as I said, he looked tremendously fit. He just stood like an athlete still, you know.
So while Buster Crabbe was certainly credible as a superhero, other actors, such as Richard Alexander here, were a little less, credible in the action figure department. His appearance and performance has much more the air of a self-conscious bank manager at a fancy dress party than the King of Arborea and love interest for the super sexy Princess Aurora. Apparently, Mr. Alexander had some input into the costume design, although I would have kept that quiet if it were me. My conclusion on first sight: was that the costumes seemed to be taken from Roman, Mongol and Robin Hood productions, and that they were just using what was available, however silly it looked, just to save some money. But I consulted Jerry Webb, and he had a very different take on what's going on.
First of all, just limiting to Flash Gordon, it followed the Alex Raymond design very closely. So the pictures in Flash Gordon correspond to the serial as published. And the most remarkable thing, and I point that out to dear Marley now, how wonderful it is, because she likes watching them with me, is that the women are all dressed elegantly. They've got long 30s style long dresses in. So Dale Arden and Princess Aura, who are the two main female contenders, but there's a few others like the Queen of Phrygia and all that. They're all very elegantly dressed, whereas the men look totally daft in weird costumes, and you can tell they're made cheap because all the actors look very second rate in the sense that they're overweight by a huge amount. Most of Ming the Merciless's guards, really needed to get on a training course.
And he does seem to have a good point. Oh well, moving on to Jean Rogers, who plays Dale Arden, and she is, well, better served by the costume department, but not by the script. In the first two series, her role is to be the person that needs rescuing and to be cuddled, fondled, and generally have her personal space invaded by almost all the male characters. So it's no surprise that in the third series, Jean Rogers ducked out, probably fed up of just being the eye candy and having to dye her hair blonde to match the comics, whereas in fact she was a brunette. So the role was taken up by fellow brunette Carol Hughes, who was inexplicably excused hair coloration duties and was given a serious role on the crew.
But you are taking Dale Arden.
Miss Arden is a chemist, a radio operator, and one of my most valuable assistants.
Not that she's ever actually caught using the radio or doing anything chemistry-like, really. Let's face reality here. None of the acting or script or production design or, well, anything really, was ever going to trouble the Oscar voters. There are the occasional spectacular scene, but they're always taken from other films, like this one from Just Imagine that we looked at in our previous video. Here is a list of some films known to have contributed over the three series, and given the popularity of many of these films, the audience must have noticed the recycling. And even when the stock footage clips are not sourced so obviously from other productions, they are repeated so often that again it must have been noticed by the audience. This particular clip, which is the Earth base of Flash Gordon's father, it's actually Mount Wilson Telescope, is a shot that is used in almost every episode, so you would think they would have got it in better quality, or at least without the camera shaking. Or there's this scene of electronics exploding, which seem to appear every 5 minutes. As with all American pre-war space films, it is very difficult with our modern sensibilities to get into what the intended aesthetic is supposed to be. There is a conflicting sentiment of magic and pseudoscience. For example, in the second series we have Azora, Queen of Magic, who has a range of magical powers confirmed by a white sapphire, and that's just pure fantasy magic. But when it comes to settings such as the use of Mount Wilson as the Earth ground station, the terminology of terms that are being used in the technobabble, and the depiction of spaceflight, Flash Gordon seems to be going for a science fiction technology aesthetic. So it's supposed to be far closer to a Star Trek than to a Lord of the Rings. And if that is a strange thing to say, I think the problem is our understanding of the 1936 worldview. So much has changed in science, culture and general understanding since then. But I think the biggest problem in trying to understand a 1930s perception is in the spaceflight itself. We've noted that Flash Gordon borrowed a lot of stuff from other productions, and a key borrowing was the spaceship from Just Imagine, which is now repurposed as Dr. Zarkov's home-built effort, giving the production a bit of class without troubling the budget too much. But before we go too hard on the production penny pinching, the team did produce the gyro ships of the Lion Men, looking particularly convincing here, and also Ming spaceships that look like a sleeker version of the Just Imagine design. Now, of course, there is some obvious technical nonsense here. No one in real life would ever make a spacecraft with doors that are too small for crew members in suits to easily get through. Well, okay, maybe that little bit was realistic, but overall we now know that these are highly questionable spacecraft concepts that would not work even to a general audience today. But as I argued when considering the film Just Imagine, in the 1930s it would appear realistic, and this was supported by experts, and yes, there was an expert view on what spaceflight would be like back then. Flash Gordon was produced at a time when an underlying realisation that spaceflight might be a possibility was beginning to gain currency. And one result was that there were many serious astronautical societies being formed across the world. And of note here is that 1 year after the American Interplanetary Society was formed, one of its members, David Lasser, published a book called The Conquest of Space. This book is regarded, at least by Wikipedia, as the first book in the English language to explain about spaceflight, and it was successful enough to almost certainly be known by the producers of Flash Gordon. As an aside here, I must take issue with Wikipedia because 2 years earlier an English physicist, John Bernal, published The World, the Flesh and the Devil, and a third of this book discusses spaceflight and its potential role on the future of humanity. So when looking at this sort of image to a 1936 audience, it probably feels technically realistic, although I also suspect that they think the whole concept of spaceflight is a complete fantasy, so realism is hardly a concern. I also suspect that they're not even thinking this way at all. They're just enjoying an action adventure with pretty girls and very unrealistic fighting, and with their suspension of disbelief fully engaged. And enough people were entertained by it for 2 sequel serials to be made. And as we've seen, these were being shown on TV and in cinemas as mainstream programming well into the 1960s. On top of that, the Flash Gordon franchise was given a post-war boost in the new medium of television. In 1954, the production rights for Flash Gordon became available, and an international consortium of production companies took it up and adapted it for television. There was just one series of 39 episodes, each 25 minutes long. Now, I've not seen all 39 of the episodes of this serial, so forgive me if I've missed something. The setup is entirely different from the pre-war serials. Indeed, apart from the names of the main protagonists, Flash, Dale and Zarkov, nothing of the original 1930 conception survives. The Power Trio are now a sort of troubleshooting team of the Galactic Bureau of Investigation. The stories, which are standalone for each episode, seem to be just thinly veiled parables of the Cold War. The consensus among experts is that this effort has even lower production values than the 1930 Buster Crab films, and I'm not going to argue with that assessment based on what I have seen. But to me, it does seem very much to match the low production standards of other TV shows of the time. And this version of Flash Gordon proved popular in the United States, although apparently not popular enough to merit a second season. One amusing feature was that the filming was mostly done in West Berlin, and they were rather short of English-speaking actors. So all the baddies, and many of the goodies, had strong German accents, woodenly repeating lines that the actors did not actually understand.
Hi, Commissioner.
Where are you, Kurt?
Just getting ready to land on Karen. Hi, Flash. Hi, beautiful. Seems that I beat you both out of a trip for once, eh?
Take care of yourself, Kurt. And watch old Akeem. He's a tough customer.
Don't worry, Flash. I'll keep my eye peeled on the old pirate. See if I can find out what he's up to, huh? Uh-oh.
The long commercial lifetime of the Flash Gordon franchise meant that even as late as the 1960s, young minds are still being contaminated by both the film serial and the TV series, which includes future filmmakers such as George Lucas and Dino De Laurentiis, the latter of whom obtained the film rights in the 1960s. Dino De Laurentiis has a past conviction in space movies. In 1968, he produced the space fantasy Barbarella. But despite having the best opening title sequence of any film in the history of cinema ever, and being the second highest grossing film in the UK that year, probably because of the title sequence, it nevertheless barely recovered its $9 million production budget. Despite this weak commercial performance, De Laurentiis still seemed to hold out some hope for space films. Maybe he was particularly incentivised when Star Wars broke the box office. However, he did not seem to absorb many lessons about why Star Wars was so financially successful or why Barbarella wasn't. Anyway, in December 1980, the world finally saw Dino De Laurentiis' version of Flash Gordon. Unlike the 1950s TV series, he went back to the comics and the 1930 film serials using the original story. This re-envisaging makes its comic background very clear in the title sequence. But this was a full-blown blockbuster with a star-studded cast, although mostly stars from the UK and Italy, which accounts for the relative success of the film in those two markets. Sam Jones and Melody Anderson played Flash Gordon and Dale Arden respectively, and both were comparatively unknown American actors following the lead of Star Wars that also cast new American talent in the leads. And like Star Wars, they were backed up with established quality artists. Max von Sydow and Topol were actors with international reputations. Ornella Muti and Mariangelina Melito were very big in Italy, and from the UK two established actors, a pre-James Bond Timothy Dalton and Brian Blessed, a British actor who is the go-to man when a director wants a quiet, subtle, nuanced performance. I have actually directed Brian myself, which I had occasion to recollect when introducing him at an evening talk at the British Interplanetary Society, and I have attached a clip at the end of this video after the credits as a sort of exhibit A. Now, all these fine actors put in good performances. Indeed, for Brian, it's probably his most famous part, and it certainly gave him his catchphrase.
Gordon's alive?
Which I can personally attest he uses at every opportunity. So we cannot blame the actors for any weaknesses in the movie. The story is a bit silly, but it's the original story stripped down and tightened up to fit in under 2 hours. And it's basically a hero's journey, which normally provides a satisfying narrative. So while the story and script may be nothing special, they're no worse than for most films. But when we look at the production design, we see some strange aspects for a movie that was released in 1980. Flash Gordon is an archetypal space adventure, so we would expect a lot of attention to be paid to the portrayal of space. Its representation of the Earth in the opening sequence is pure 1930s, and in no way does it match the real space photographs that were by now in the public consciousness. In the takeoff scene, things are a little better, but compared with 2001 and Star Wars, it looks cheap and unconvincing. But this is not a question of budget. It had the same real terms budget as 2001, and the first Star Wars was produced on half the money. But considered as a space film, Flash Gordon doesn't even reach a B-movie level. One's left wondering where the money went. But when it comes to scenes like this, I guess it becomes clearer, which I find an interesting production priority, and I think it shows us what this film is really trying to be. This film makes more sense when looked at as a loving reconstruction of the aesthetic of the 1930 serial, and even more of the comic strip. As a consequence, the film's aesthetic is anachronistic. I've argued that in the 1930s, Flash Gordon was accepted as what spaceflight could be like. It was the fairy space of its time. But by 1980, after 2001 and Star Wars, fairy space has moved on. So this movie strikes a 1980s audience as just pure silly fantasy with no attempt at realism. So was the world ready for a campy, high-budget 1930s reimagining? Well, judging from the box office, no. The box office was only double the production costs, which after post-production costs like promotion are included means it barely made any money at all. The first Star Wars made 70 times the money it cost to make, which is why The Empire Strikes Back was inevitable, and a sequel to Flash Gordon was never going to happen. Flash Gordon did grow into a so-called cult classic later for those enamoured of the camp and glitzy, although not so much in the UK because we've got Strictly Come Dancing to scratch that particular itch. So I think it is the failure to fit in with the current space genre aesthetic that lets the rebooted Flash Gordon down, rather than any basic premise. It's a passion art project which, however well done, was not going to resonate with the zeitgeist. After all, for the last half-century, we've all been gripped by another action space adventure series with emperors and princesses and planet-destroying death rays, proved by the fact that whosever assessment you look at, Star Wars is in the top 3 movie franchises of all time, behind only the various incarnations of the Marvel Universe and ahead of Harry Potter and James Bond. So I think we can draw 2 significant conclusions here. The first conclusion is that not only is the adherence to fairy space genre important to the audience's reception, but what constitutes fairy space changes over time. One of the goals of these reviews is to try and explore how much of this change is due to humanity's evolving experience of real spaceflight, and how much is it an evolving fashion from movie to movie. And the second conclusion? Well, it's that Flash Gordon is very much alive and well, thank you very much. He's just changed his name to Skywalker.
You can start now.
Right, this is where we edit the start.
Is it?
Okay, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, formally we're going to start the proceedings off. It's my great pleasure as President of the British Interplanetary Society to welcome Brian Blessed to our society and to introduce you to him. A few years back, I actually had the privilege of directing Brian Blessed, which is something not many engineers can put on their CVs. As you can imagine, it was a bit of a challenge. The problem is, a lot of performers and actors, when they take on a role, they become the role. They become the dramatic persona, and any of their own personality, assuming that they've got one, is then hidden under the role. And this is easy to deal with, but then there's other actors, of which Brian, of course, is an exemplary, almost an archetypal example. It is when their real life persona, the versus persona, if you'll have it, is the basis of the character. And then the director has to achieve a balance between the Brian Blessedness in the character and a character that then fits within the project's objectives, so you don't compromise its artistic integrity or even get the point of jarring the audience out of the suspension of disbelief in the world that you're creating. Now, there's a number of techniques as a director you can use to get that sort of finely balanced performance out of an artist. The one I chose was right up to the start to say to Brian, "How do you want to do this, Mr. Blessed, sir?" And then I did everything he told me to.